We just saw how to pass data from one component to another, but how can we validate this data to ensure that a component receives data of the type it expects? We can do that by changing the props property to an object, with the keys being the name of a property and the value being its type. So let's go ahead and refactor this to an object and add the author key being the name of the property that this component accepts, and the value is going to be object being its type. This now means that if we pass a value for the author property that is not an object, Vue will show a warning in the browser's console, apart from the code obviously not working. This means that it's easier to see which data and types a component expects, so this is also a kind of metadata, you could say. And it gives the benefit that you're more likely to catch type errors in development instead of in production. If I wanted to allow multiple types for a given property, I could have added an array as the value, which should then be an array of allowed types. It's also possible to define whether or not a given property is required, as well as its default value. To do that, we must add an object instead of adding the type directly. So let's change this type to an object and add a type property being object, similar to what we saw before, and then add a required property and set it to a Boolean value. In this case, I'll set it to true, but if no required key is defined, then a property is optional by default. To add a default value, we should unsurprisingly add a key named default to the object. If the type of the property is a primitive type, such as a string or number, then you can just add the default value directly as the value for the default key, like this in case our property were a number. However, if the type is array or object, as in this case, then things get a little tricky. If this is the case, then the value must be a function returning the default value, similar to how we do with the data property. So let's see an example of this, because what we have here is indeed an object. So within this function, I can just return a default value. In this case, I'm returning an empty object. Now, using the default option together with a required option of true makes no sense, so it's of course only useful for optional properties. So in this case, I could go ahead and remove this required property. Or instead, I'll go ahead and remove the default value because actually I want this property to be required. And that's how you can easily validate data that is passed to a given component.